This morning, we're going to continue our really very strong bipartisan efforts on the 21st Century Cures Initiative with this roundtable to discuss ideas that the committee has received over the last couple of months and to look to more specifics about the steps that we can take to accelerate the cycle of cures, embrace technology advances, and the rise of personalized medicine, and keep America, in fact, the innovation capital of the world. Over August and early this month, our committee members, including DeGette, Pitts, Burgess, Lance, Bilrakis, Shimkus, Latta, and Johnson, held roundtables across the country to hear about how American innovation is providing hope, saving lives, and yes, creating jobs. The 21st Century Cures Initiative affects every American, everyone, as they, their families, or their friends have been affected by disease. As our committee members heard during August, hard work remains to find and deliver cures and treatments for the approximately 95% of diseases without cures. We've seen an outpouring of support both outside and inside Washington to work together and to achieve this common goal. So today, to continue that work towards more cures and treatments, we brought together truly another all-star roundtable. Joining us, we have Secretary Sylvia Burwell, HHS, Secretary of HHS, Dr. Francis Collins, again, Director of the NIH, Dr. Margaret Hamburg, again, Commissioner of the FDA, Michael Milken, Chairman of the Milken Institute, Dean Kamen, founder of DK Research and Development, Mr. Bill Parfit, Chairman and CEO of MPI Research from Mattawan, Michigan, and Dr. Dan Theodescu, Director of the University of the Colorado Cancer Center. We need to hear from our participants as much as possible. That's why we have this roundtable today. We're going to listen. So I know that my colleagues agree with me that the participants are the experts, and this roundtable is an opportunity to learn. To that end, while we may want to ask the experts some questions to guide the conversation, we want to keep our talking to the minimum. And I'd also ask the participants to try to keep their answers brief so that we can keep the conversation moving, knowing that we have really a hard stop at noon. In closing, I want to thank these folks who have offered their input on the 21st Century Cures initiatives. I can't tell you how much we appreciate the thoughtful contributions, especially those of everyday Americans. So we intend to release a cures legislative discussion draft in early January 2015. We'll look to swiftly move the legislation early in the next Congress. So if you want your idea considered, you can send it to cures@mail.house.gov really as quickly as possible. The more specific the idea, the better that it'll be. So now I want to turn to my colleague, Diana DeGette from the great state of Colorado.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for convening this last roundtable. And I want to welcome everybody here today. I see Chairman Tozan here today, in whose shadow we toil, so I'm glad that he's here. And I also want to thank Secretary Burwell for coming. I know she's got a very busy day. And of course, my homie, Dr. Theodescu from the University of Colorado. I want to thank you for coming all the way out here. As Fred said, we've been working together to hold a big series of roundtables and hearings on the 21st Century Cures Initiative, and we've also taken many white papers. We've had a lot of suggestions, but I think we will both agree that we have a lot of commonality in the themes that we're hearing, and we're eager to sit down and actually start drafting legislation. The roundtable that we had in Denver over the break, we talked about personalized medicine, and we had active engagement and interest from the audience. We heard from the NIH and the FDA. We heard from local universities and health centers and private investors, industry and researchers, and we're really beginning to hone in on some areas that we can think about how we streamline the process so that we can get from the lab to the clinic. And that's very important to all of us. One of the things we talked about, for example, was the potential time and cost savings of a central IRB process, which is something I have been working on for a long time. We also talked about the importance of sharing data and information among clinical registries. And these are just some of the topics that fall under this. Today, what we're doing is we're looking for feedback from participants on what we've learned so far and where we can go. And I'm really happy to see so many members here. Some of the common topics that we've seen are modernizing clinical trials, facilitating data collection and data sharing, incentivizing drug and device research for unmet needs, incorporating the patient perspective into the research and regulatory process, and developing young emerging scientists, as well as making sure we have adequate and stable funding for biomedical research in this country. And so I'm looking forward to hear from our experts and also our colleagues today about how we can make a positive difference. I just want to echo your thanks for all of the members, all of the participants who have worked so diligently on this. It just really shows that there's a need. And I want to leave you with one thought. I went around my district in August, and some of you might know, just as happens every 2 years in election year, Colorado's a purple state, so we have shock and awe of campaigning going on there right now. And every time I talk to somebody, Democrat, Republican, or unaffiliated, about 21st century cures, their eyes lit up. They were so excited about the prospect of bipartisan legislation where we would actually be working together in Congress to do something, but even more to do something big about how we can get those cures to the patients. And that's why I think we've got the germ of something here. I told a group last night, the big risk is it falls of its own weight. We can't let that happen. We have to work together to make it happen. And so I just really appreciate this effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll start with Secretary Burwell.
Thank you, Chairman Upton and Representative DeGette, for convening this roundtable and for having me here today. I'm looking forward to working with all of you, and that is why I am here today. And while I'm sorry I won't be able to say Dr. Collins and Dr. Hamburg, who are two of our best at HHS, will ably represent us, but I wanted to come because of what you both have said, the importance. I'm here today because we want to be your partner in making something go forward. I'm a big believer, and if we're going to deliver impact, we need to start by building those strong relationships. That means listening to the experts we have and listening together and being responsive as we work together for meaningful solutions. And I want to just first thank you also for what you all did in terms of bringing everyone together. But this committee has also done important work previously in this space with FDA and our user fee legislation. And these roundtables, I think, are an excellent way to continue making some of the progress that we've already made. When we watch a loved one who's taken by Alzheimer's or ALS, we want the same things. We want the most effective treatments, the groundbreaking cures, and the best medical care possible. And so we take at HHS that very seriously, and we're committed to keeping us on that cutting edge of innovation, science, and technology. And NIH has supported most every significant advance of biomedical research in the last 50 years. And we've led, from the Human Genome Project, and we're attempting right now to unlock those secrets of the most complex, mysterious things like the brain. And Dr. Collins and his team walk the line, I think, some days between science and science fiction in terms of whether it's robotic exoskeletons, nanotechnology developments, or the revolutionary possibilities of personalized medicine and what that can mean. This work isn't just improving our health care system, it's hopefully going to transform it. These advancements allow us to shift from keeping up with illnesses to getting ahead of illnesses, and they empower patients to engage in their own health care like never before. And new biomedical science and technologies create high-paying jobs and strengthen our economy, another important part of what this work is about. And in fact, we have estimates that say for every dollar of NIH funding, it generates over $1 in local economic growth. So at a time when the world is vigorously forging ahead in medical innovation, we must protect our competitive edge and make sure that we're a global leader and not falling behind. With that said, we have a crucial equilibrium to maintain, and HHS tries to balance that in terms of the speed of discovery with the oversight that keeps us safe as a nation, and that's why Dr. Hamburg will be speaking to those issues. FDA is committed to reducing the length and cost of medical product development. We've shortened the average high-risk device review times by a third since 2009. Also working to strengthen and improve the medical product review process. And we're expanding accelerated development pathways. So last year, nearly half the new drugs approved took advantage of expedited development and review approaches, with review times as short as 4.5 months. So over the last few years, we've made some great progress with support, and we appreciate that. But we also know there's a lot more to be done in that space, and we want to focus on that as part of this conversation. We're committed to partnering with you while continuing to maintain a safe and accurate product data and information for people. So with that, we look forward to working with you all. This kind of session where a conversation can occur, I think, is an important part to moving forward in the committee process, which we want to engage and support. So thank you for having me.
Well, I just want to say that you and I talked about this literally the first week that you became Secretary of HHS, and you indicated then you would be very supportive, and we're delighted for your participation today and all the way down the line. So we really appreciate you being here, knowing that you still have to leave a little bit early. But thank you. Peggy, do you want to say something?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for including me in this discussion, and importantly for the leadership that Chairman Upton and Congresswoman DeGette have brought to this 21st Century Cures, and all of you on the committee. And it is true, as Secretary Burwell said, that this committee has done great work to support science and the advance of biomedical product innovation. And, you know, most recently with the passage of FDASIA, I think we really accomplished something that's remarkably important and in a very bipartisan way. This activity goes to the heart of what matters for us at FDA. Our mission is to deliver on the promise of science for the public, to do our part, not just in assuring the most streamlined review times, but also in helping to support the most effective and efficient research and development pathways for promising new products, and to be able to provide information and oversight throughout the whole lifespan of a product, not just in the development and review stage, but also when it's in the marketplace being used by people, when we have the opportunity to learn more about what works and for whom and why. And, you know, we think that the discussion so far has been enormously productive, and the identification of some of the critical areas that Congresswoman DeGette noted are ones that very much align with our priorities and perceived needs. We want to work with all of you to continue to reduce the length and cost of medical product development, to improve medical product review, of course, improving business processes and systems, but also to bring new tools and perspectives to bear, more advanced science and technology, patient perspectives, and of course increasing the predictability and transparency and partnership in what we do. We think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the work that's been going on with accelerated development, including the breakthrough designation that Congress enabled us to move forward with the passage of FDASIA. And some of those lessons are that the more FDA engages with stakeholders, and importantly with companies as they develop products, to make sure that the right studies are done, we can reduce the time for research and development. We can certainly dramatically decrease the time for review, and most importantly, we can give the American people the products that they want and need, recognizing that the ability to really advance biomedical product innovation is essential for the health of individuals and families, but it's also vital to the health of our healthcare system and the health of our economy and the continuing preeminence of our great country in this important sector. So I'm really delighted to be part of this and look forward to moving to the next stage of really translating all these good ideas into action.
Great. Bill?
So thank you, Fred, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'll take just a few minutes to give my background, not to impress, I'm humbled by how little I know, but to share with you at least where I'll be coming from as we have these discussions today. So I'm 67 years old, and for the last, I'm proud of it. And for the last 50 years, I've been developing drugs. I worked at the Upjohn Company for 25 years. Then I started my own CRO, which is a contract research organization. So we do business for small biotechs, many of whom just have 3 months of cash flow and 6 employees. But yet, as we know today, they've been very effective and productive in bringing new products to the market. And I also served as chairman of Stryker Corporation, which is a device company located also in our district. So I'm pleased with my background, humbled by what I don't know, but excited about what we can do here today and in subsequent periods before your legislation moves forward. And I've listed, and I'm not going to go through them now, but I hope during the 2 hours that we have here today, what I consider to be the critical success factors for our success going forward. Talking about such things as the collaborative role we need between the private sector and industry and government, and including regulations that are required and can be a real companion to what we're doing, including looking at the changing role of the patient. We have to have a changing role for the patient, including the consequences of risk, which are sometimes becoming so onerous that risk takers don't want to step up to the plate with some really innovative ideas, and looking also at the role of government in terms of helping out some of these smaller biotechs that have great ideas but don't have the funding sources. And then finally, making sure that we can energize our young people to be rigorous scientists. We clearly are we have the best healthcare system in the world. We have the best ability to innovate in this world, and we want to unshackle some of the impediments that over time have allowed us to be the best that we possibly can be. So I'm pleased to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Dean?
I'm Dean Kamen. I'm not 67, but I've spent a lifetime designing and building medical equipment. Over the last few decades, as everybody in this room is aware, I'm concerned that the pace at which technology is developing is increasing. We're in the 21st century and accelerating. The pace at which the systems around it are moving makes us feel like we're trapped in a 19th century model, trying to deal with 21st century opportunities. Again, I guess over the next few hours, I'd like to maybe talk about a few of them, but a list of things that I think should be non-controversial that could help things go better, since, as Michael Milken has said more than once, the whole issue is time and money. We got to shorten the time and reduce the cost. If CMS and FDA and all the other agencies that are part of the chain of events could work together so that we could, for instance, in parallel, do all the work we need to do as industry to deal with CMS and reimbursement at the same time as we go through the FDA process, things would get faster and simpler and cheaper. Another issue which I hope is non-controversial: no business I know could run if it lost 25% of its people every year. We have had multiple projects come through the FDA, and the reviewer changes. One of our most recent projects, the reviewer changed 4 times. Each time you sort of do a restart. It's expensive and it's frustrating. It takes time and costs money. We have to find a better way to keep continuity on the government side of this process. The third, and I'm glad that the Congresswoman brought it up, is IRBs. You develop a product, you want to get it tested around the country, you go through a pretty detailed, expensive process of getting an internal review board to approve it. That's a necessary thing. It protects the public and the company. But you want to do it in 3 or 4 different major medical centers, you have to go through that whole process separately in each one. That's a little crazy. We should find a way to make that more universal. International competition. It's not just that they compete sort of in the marketplace. These days, most of my major partners, the biggest companies in the world that want to take our products out, look at the situation, and because of the lack of certainty in how long it will take to get a product approved, or the lack of certainty of what the reimbursement will be for it, almost universally now, we transitioned to a world where our biggest clients would prefer to go and launch a product in Europe or Japan than in the United States. And that hurts on many levels. It makes the product less accessible in the United States. it has a lot of bad implications, and we should recognize as a country we should be competing to be the most favorable place to attract innovation. And finally, and maybe it's just a small one to some of you, the device tax, which does nothing but make things more expensive, but it's really kind of a slap in the face to this industry. You could say it's only a few percent, but a few percent is a pretty big number to people that are trying to make a new product, and particularly because it's uniquely a medical device tax. As a matter of public policy, we learned that you tax tobacco or you tax alcohol, you have luxury taxes. There are certain kinds of taxes that the government puts out because they're trying to encourage or discourage certain kinds of behavior. I don't know why people that are trying to make life-saving equipment should be taxed the way you tax industries that you're trying to say it's a luxury or it's a sin tax. I don't like to be lumped with that crowd, and I think it's bad policy.
Thank you. Dr. Tedesco. Yeah, get close, and the green light on.
It's a privilege to be here. And a little bit about myself. I'm director of the University of Colorado Comprehensive Cancer Center. In that role, I'm charged to really set the vision and the synergies of cancer research at the University of Colorado, which is a consortium comprehensive cancer center, which means we encompass 3 universities as part of our consortium. I also have a very vibrant laboratory that's funded by the federal government with multiple NIH grants, and our area of interest is really doing personalized medicine, establishing genomic tests to assign therapeutics, as well as doing drug discovery. In addition, because of my role as Cancer Center Director, I'm involved directly or indirectly with clinical trials, and I also get a lot of positive and complaints from our membership regarding the access and process of clinical trials. So I think I bring a perspective of both a user and also somebody that's recipient of feedback from my colleagues. You know, I think this enterprise, biomedicine, is basically bringing upon a defining moment for this country, because this is something that is going to be the future. Personalized and precision medicine and how we do it is really our moment in time. The United States, thanks very much to Dr. Collins' initiative and vision, has built an incredible genomic engine and infrastructure, and has resulted in a lot of technology to really push forward molecular and biotechnology and medicine. It would be a shame now to not capitalize that and maintain our national and international leadership in this area. So we have a great opportunity, and this initiative is really fundamentally important, I think, both from a health perspective and doing right and doing good by our citizens, but our international leadership, and also for the economy. And we've discussed a number of things about the universal IRBs, et cetera. There are tangible things that we can do. One of them, for example, is aligning the reimbursement process with the regulatory process for biomarkers. Biomarkers are really the part and parcel companions to targeted agents. You cannot have a targeted agent without a biomarker. They will hand in hand to really go and establish the essence of personalized medicine. We need to establish the guidelines for biomarker development, because the biomarker sphere is really an area that is a lot less reimbursed than drug development, and yet is really fundamental to precision medicine. So we really could think that, and how we have parallel tracks, so companies, small biotechs, small businesses can really develop biomarkers and have a possibility, an expectation, a return on investment to grow this economy. The other sort of vignette that I like to bring out is really in trying to protect our patients. Patients are basically the heart and soul of translational medicine. We rely on them. We're eternally grateful for their participation, but we need to encourage them to participate, which means removing barriers. When we have consent forms for drug trials that are 40 pages long, even though they're written at the 8th grade level. You know, perhaps my children, when they're in 8th grade, were not as smart, but I can tell you, they were really not prepared to read 40 pages. I think we really need to visit this, because in trying to protect people, we're actually dissuading them from participating, and therefore we're hurting them. So we really need to rethink that. And so that's just a vignette of a practical thing that we could do in addition to the central IRBs and supporting our young investigators. That support can be in the form of facilitating the translational research operation. People that want to do translational research in medicine have to have a clear career path and have to basically be able to spend their time really with forward motion, getting trials done, getting patients on trial. If the barriers to accruing patients to clinical trials are so high, then we're going to get progressively fewer young investigators wanting to embark on those careers. It's not a money thing. It's basically trying to overcome obstacles, and after a while, you just get tired, and you go and do other things. So we need to remove those barriers, and that will promote our young investigators and also the entire translational infrastructure of clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I commend the work that both you and Representative Gett have done in these efforts. I am here today not as the chairman of the Milken Institute. I'm here today not as the chairman founder of Faster Cures. I'm here today not as the chairman and founder of the Prostate Cancer Foundation. And I'm here today not as one of the founders of the Melanoma Research Alliance or advisor to the Focus Ultrasound Foundation. I'm here today as an American who lost 10 relatives to cancer, and representative of the men and women in America, 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women that will be diagnosed with cancer. And I'm the happiest person to be with you today, Mr. Chairman, and that they gave me 12 to 18 months to live when I was diagnosed with cancer 21 years ago. And I'm here to remind the committee that 50% of all economic growth in the last 200 years has come from bioscience and public health. That the greatest achievement in the history of the world has been the increase in worldwide life expectancy from 31 years of age in 1900 to over 70 today. It took millions of years for average life expectancy to go from 20 to 31. And a little more in a century, we've risen average life expectancy from 31 to 70. I'm here today to remind all of us that it was 20 years ago that a woman had more than a 90% chance of passing HIV or AIDS onto her children. And today, with modern science, the probability of passing it on has gone from over 90 to 2. It's easy to understand economic growth when in sub-Saharan Africa, life expectancy has now increased by 50% in a generation, with 2/3 of everyone living with HIV or AIDS living in sub-Saharan Africa today. And it is no surprise, as a result, that today 6 or 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world in this century are in sub-Saharan Africa, due to the great benefits of U.S. medical science. Possibly the greatest contribution of the United States to the world has been the benefits of this medical science that is available to so many people today. Those countries that lead in the biosciences will lead the world in this century. We're not just talking about health, but we're talking about agriculture, environment, energy, air, water, etc. And so we're at the dawn of the golden age. This enormous investment that the American public has made, with the leadership both in the administration and the Senate and the House approving in '98 an increase in funding which now exceeds over $200 billion. We're about to reap those benefits. Whether those benefits will accrue to the United States of America or to some other country will be determined by the leadership and the commitment of this committee and others today. There are 5 easy lessons that we could talk about today that we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years. 1, putting patients at the center of discovery, development, and the delivery process. More efficient clinical trials. Meaningful working relationships between patients and disease-specific organizations. One of the great advancements of the last 2 decades has been the strengthening and improvement of disease-specific organizations research group. 2, incentivize collaboration across sectors throughout the R&D process. Public-private partnership. All we have to do is go look at the history books and see those partnerships between Ford and Kaiser and the government that allowed us to have victory in World War II as we moved our for-profit industrial companies quickly to produce ships and other products we needed during World War II. 3, encourage novel financial solutions that address the riskiest R&D endeavors. Change this risk-return ratio. As an example, Mr. Chairman, all we have to do is look at acid rain, a major issue in the latter part of the 1980s in America. Movies, public hearings, etc., the loss of life to acid rain. The creation of a financial market for sulfur index that allowed people to reduce their emissions, get credits, or those that could not to buy credits. Within 7 years, eliminated 95% of all the acid rain in America. Strengthening the basic translational research infrastructure, dependent heavily on next generation of young scientists. Today, STEM education is the rage for both men and women, boys and girls in America. After 15 years of studying, PhDs, MDs, internships, residency, we have little to promise them in the future. And today, America is losing our best and brightest students to the rest of the world, and we run the risk of losing an entire generation of young scientists, either to other countries in the world or to other fields today. And 5th, ensure sustainable and predictable funding for our science agencies, NIH, FDA, NCI, CDC, CMS, etc. It's impossible to build an organization or recruit the talent you need when on a year-to-year basis you don't know whether you can fund them. The probability of a young scientist today being funded is the lowest it's been in more than 4 decades. This golden age is in front of us. We think about the cost and to do no harm. But in many ways, by lengthening time, we are losing lives. By not providing access to the state-of-the-art treatments today, but not incorporating science. In many ways, science today is running in the 21st century. But as Dean has pointed out, it's running on tracks from the 19th and the 20th century. We wonder why today in America that the average train, symbolic of science, travels at the exact same speed it traveled at 100 years ago. It has nothing to do with science or the ability of the train to move. It is running on tracks that cannot afford to have trains run at those speeds. And as we look at China and other countries around the world whose trains run 2 to 3 times as fast as ours, it's not that they have different technology. It's they've allowed different infrastructure, 21st infrastructure, to run those. And one of the things I'm quite confident on is the work of this committee will help allow us to build that 21st century infrastructure.
Well, I'm Francis Collins, the Director of the National Institutes of Health, and Mike Milken has, I think, wonderfully articulated both the promise and the challenge of living up to that promise. I want to thank Chairman Upton and Representative DeGette for convening this whole series of discussions, and many members of this committee who have participated by convening similar hearings and roundtables in various parts of the country. I was here for the first roundtable on May the 6th in this room. I was 2 weeks ago in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when Representative Pitts convened a very interesting group of us around that table. And it is enormously inspiring and encouraging to all of us involved in biomedical research to have this kind of focused attention on the opportunities that now lie in front of us for developing these 21st century cures. I live a paradoxical life because as the director of the NIH, I have the opportunity on a daily basis to see amazing science that is possible, things that I would not have dreamed would happen in my own lifetime. But at the same time, I also preside over an effort which, as Mike has laid out, is under the greatest stress that it has seen in 4 decades, with young scientists who find it increasingly difficult to be able to see a path forward to live out their visions. And so it is welcome indeed that this group has come together to try to see what could be done to catalyze greater progress and those cures that are still being waited for in those roughly 7,000 diseases, only 500 of which currently have a therapy that's available. The Genome Project, I think, helped us a lot in stepping into a new space here because we now have technologies that allow us to look into the intricate details of how a cell does what it does and how things go wrong in the presence of disease. And yet we're not capitalizing on that opportunity at the level that we might. My own area of genomics, I can't help but point out that while we, the United States, led the Human Genome Project and from that derived great benefit, recent estimate, the return on that investment is 178 to 1 in terms of economic growth that derived from our leadership of that effort. And yet if you ask me now, where is the largest investment in genomics in the world? It is not in the United States. It is in Shenzhen, China. They read our playbook. They saw what an opportunity was there. They took advantage of that. Meanwhile, we, over the now 11 years since the Genome Project was completed in 2003, have seen a steady decrease in our ability to support research, with now about a 23% cut in our purchasing power for biomedical research since 2003. And the results of that is our subsequent loss of the leadership that was basically clearly ours at that point. Don't get me wrong, I celebrate what other countries are doing to contribute to biomedical research, but why would we, the United States, with all the talent and creativity and vision here, decide to exit the stage just when it was getting interesting? We clearly have a critical role to play here. I really appreciate the way in which this 21st Century Cures effort is asking very specific questions of what could be done by the Congress in legislative terms that would assist us in terms of our ability to go faster. And we will be supplying, and I've already mentioned in some of the other sessions, specific examples of that sort, and it's getting to be quite a long list. And some are big ideas, and some of them seem kind of small, but they would help us a lot. They kind of fall into 3 categories. One is how to enhance participant protection and increase transparency, to encourage participation by people in clinical trials and in biomedical research, but also make it clear that we are transparent about how we do this. Such things as providing privacy protections for individuals who are participating in research so that their private data doesn't find its way into unauthorized places. Simply prohibiting, for instance, unauthorized re-identification of individuals based on their DNA sequence would be an important step forward. A second area is to facilitate scientific collaborations and innovation. And we've already heard about some of those issues as relates to central IRBs, something that we also feel quite strongly about, and the common rule, which is the way in which we have overseen human subjects research for 20 years, is desperately in need of an upgrade. And that's a lot of work has been done on that, but it has not come across the finish line. A simple area that in one way is getting in our path, our new National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. For reasons that I think reflected anxieties about whether this would be competitive with the private sector, is legislatively prohibited from pursuing clinical trials beyond phase 2A. Something which now at the present time really makes very little sense, and I think almost nobody would support the rationale for that, given that we have worked very hard to be sure we are in no way competing with private sector efforts. It would be nice to fix that, just as one simple thing. And the third category, reduce administrative burden and increase efficiency. The famous Paperwork Reduction Act has been, for NIH, the source of the greatest amount of paperwork that you can imagine when it comes to individuals who are trying to run simple studies where they wish to actually do a survey. And this happens many times for trainees in our intramural program. You may not know that you can't run a survey to ask people about their opinions about precision medicine, for instance, if you're going to ask more than 9 people, unless you go to the OMB and get approval for that. That takes about 9 months, at which point the trainee is about ready to leave. So clearly, there's some helps we could use here. And all those reports, if you start adding up the reports that are congressionally required, and which, as far as I can tell, nobody reads, but which requires many hours of busy people's time, it would be great to sort of go down the list and throw out a lot of those that really have, if they once served a purpose, no longer do so. But again, I just want to say how critical it is that we look at this issue from a holistic perspective of all the ways that our enterprise could be more vigorous and more healthy. And particularly, as Mike Milken has said, and others, Diana DeGette mentioned it as well, the need for a stable sort of support system. There's a great sense now of instability, of insecurity, of a trajectory that nobody can be quite sure of. And that's the worst thing you can do if you're trying to encourage innovation. To find that path forward would make a huge difference. And it will make a difference in very concrete ways of saving lives. I'll tell you one other story which is very much on my mind, and then I'll yield up. Here we are, all of us, deeply troubled by what we see happening in West Africa. The number of deaths from the Ebola outbreak, now over 2,000, and with no end in sight because of the way in which this terrible disorder is spreading rapidly like wildfire in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. The NIH began working on a vaccine for Ebola in 2001. We have steadily pursued that effort over these last 13 years, hoping that by the time a big outbreak occurred, we would be ready for it. That vaccine has now been in animal trials, shown to be highly effective, but as of this summer, when the outbreak really began to catch fire, had not yet quite reached the point of a phase 1 clinical trial. We worked in record time with enormous assistance from our colleagues at FDA to speed up the process. And last week, the first volunteers at the NIH Clinical Center were injected with this vaccine in a phase 1 trial to determine whether, in fact, it is going to be safe. And in another 2 or 3 months, we will know that and then hopefully be in a position to begin a phase 2 trial in the places where it's most needed in Africa. But I have to tell you, if we had not gone through this 10-year decline in the support of biomedical research, we would be a year or 2 ahead of where we are now. And think of what the difference that would make. Had we, in 2014, been in a position to distribute rapidly tens of thousands of doses in collaboration with our colleagues at GSK of this vaccine, how much different would this be and how many lives would have been saved? So the consequences of what's happened in the last 10 years are not just that it's been tough on some scientific researchers, although it really has been. Not just that it's damaged our ability to take advantage of economic growth that otherwise would have happened. It's also that lives are not being saved that could have been. So the importance of this conversation could hardly be greater, and I thank you for the chance to be part of it.
Well, thank you all. Great experts in your fields, and I didn't mention at the beginning that not only is this committee united in working on this together, but we also have the commitment of leadership on both sides. Steny Hoyer was there, testified that first day back on May 6th, and Kevin McCarthy, our new majority leader, is on board as well. Well, let's open this up for a discussion. Frank, your first hand.
Thank you. I want to say to both you and Diana how valuable I think that these roundtables have been. And we had one, I guess it was it only a week ago? Seems like 2 weeks ago with Chairman Pitts in his hometown in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I thought was very good. I wanted to follow up on something that Commissioner Hamburg mentioned that day. You had talked about engaging patients, and I think you were responding to to some extent to the woman who was from my district, from Edison, who was with the Hydrocephalus Foundation. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, how we can engage patients. And I was particularly referencing that I know in the user fee bill we had a provision that allows patients to be part of the advisory panels. So that would be maybe one example of how we engage patients, and maybe you could talk about that specifically. But I didn't want you to just limit it to that. It's just the idea of engaging patients, because a lot of times, as you know, the initiatives in terms of legislation that we pass on the floor, and some of the bills that we did last night on the floor, actually come from these patient groups, if you will, who were so grassroots and involved and spend a lot of their life on some of these as part of these foundations like that. So if you could just elaborate a little more and mention something about the advisory panels and patient participation.
Well, thank you. It's such an important question, and this is a critical time as we're really rethinking, not just within the FDA, more broadly, about how to really put patients at the center of what we're doing and really include the patient perspective and reflect the patient needs in the work that we're doing. It goes far beyond engagement on advisory panels. We do have patient representatives on advisory panels, but it really is to sit down with patients and patient groups in a systematic way to better understand their experience and their perspectives on the products that they're using, whether drugs or medical devices, and what they actually need, to better understand how they are experiencing their disease and what are the critical symptoms of their disease that they want addressed, and then how we can, and what of course are the unmet needs, and then how can we actually incorporate that into both product development and product review. For example, biomarkers was mentioned with respect to personalized medicine and really looking at genetic traits and linking it to a therapy. But we also want to be able to use patient-reported outcomes like biomarkers in order to make sure that we are assessing both the right measures of whether a product is having an impact, and use those measures in a more fundamental way to define success. So I think that is really critically important. The other thing I would mention, and of course Mike Milken and his various philanthropies and organizations have been leaders in this area, but the role of patient-specific philanthropies and organizations. And we increasingly work with them as well as with the research community and product sponsors to really identify critical needs and opportunities, and then together think about how to shape in particular the clinical trials that need to be done, but other aspects of data collection, so that the research and development and review process can be as accelerated as possible. One good example is the work that was done with the scientific community and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation to develop a new drug, Kalydeco, which is for a subsection of patients with cystic fibrosis that have a particular genetic marker, but it's the first drug that really treats the underlying cause of illness and not just the symptoms with this devastating disease, cystic fibrosis, building on research that actually Francis Collins did a while back. But this has been transformative in terms of the lives of these patients, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation really made this work possible because they helped to create the patient community necessary to rapidly move into clinical trials, to get the tissue as well as the patients that could create a foundation for understanding the opportunity and moving forward quickly on it, and put up some critical resources, not just patients, but also dollar resources to help move the project forward. So there's a lot of important activity in this area, and I think that we need to look at what's being done and its incredible success, and importance and then build on it. And I do think that this effort, 21st Century Cures, can put a major focus on this and help us advance this work.
Thank you.
Mike Burgess.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to all of our panelists for being here. Dr. Collins, the offer still stands. I will be one of your test subjects for the safety of the Ebola vaccine. You rejected me on age criteria before. I thought that was obviously discriminatory on your part, but
I had to reject myself on the same grounds.
I still stand ready to offer my services. We had a good, with Manhattan Institute, we had a very good roundtable up in, and I think Faster Cures was part of that up in Boston. And the concept of adaptive licensing came up. Currently, of course, go through clinical trials. Something's either approved or not approved. It's a binary function, and once it's approved, it's assumed to be safe and effective until proven otherwise. But the adaptive licensing pathway that some are using really did seem to have some appeal because we live in the information age. So the rapidity with which something could come to perhaps partial approval, the feedback, the rapid learning that is now possible with the information systems that we have, it seems like this would be a reasonable direction in which to proceed. So I hope it's something we will consider when we write our legislation. But I'd also ask the administrator at the FDA, is this something that you all are looking into or would be receptive to in the realm of adaptive licensing?
Well, it's very much a topic of discussion, and we have been involved deeply with counterpart regulatory authorities in other countries that are also looking at this, as well as the scientific community, to look at what are the opportunities to get robust scientific answers from a range of innovative approaches in terms of clinical trial design that can underlie licensure, and also innovative regulatory pathways. At the present time, the FDA actually has quite an array of tools and regulatory flexibility thanks to our work with Congress, including in FDASIA with the breakthrough designation. And in fact, our approaches are not binary in the sense that accelerated approval, for example, using, again, going back to biomarkers, using biomarkers as surrogate endpoints, enables us to move a product with promise into the marketplace, but then collect data in a continuing way to actually then assure the final approval if the product really works and provides an overall benefit for patients. But this is an area that I think is ripe with opportunity to explore. How can we streamline, modernize, and best adapt our regulatory pathways to make a difference? I think that Secretary Burwell mentioned that half of the recently approved drugs used various methods for expedited approval, and that is making a huge difference. Breakthrough designation is proving to be a real benefit. And I would have to tell you that I think one of the most important things to emerge in the recent years in terms of all of this work is that what makes the most difference in actually reducing times from discovery to the bedside is really the ability for the researchers and the companies and FDA to all work together early and in a continuing way to shape the development process, to identify what is the data that's needed to move us as swiftly as possible over the finish line. And I think that is really where the most important work needs to be done to make the most difference for patients.
Well, I have to add then the comment was made this morning about the 25% turnover, that someone is working with someone at the FDA, they're getting to a point where perhaps the next steps are ready to be taken, and boom, you got to go back to square one. I mean, I hear this all the time. It's not new.
Well, that's a huge concern, for us, and, it reflects, unfortunately, that people are stretched too thin, they work too hard, they burn out, the conditions are challenging, and they're very competitive in other sectors. So I think we need to address those issues. The user fee legislation has enabled us to begin a process of hiring on more people and being able to really create the training and management systems that we are intending to help us do a better job at recruiting and retaining people. But that is an essential issue, and it can undermine all of the best efforts. Adaptive licensure will not fix that problem. We need to address the issue of recruitment and retainment, I think, in a very targeted and forceful way, because it is essential and it has so many critical ramifications.
And cross-training within the institution, so it's not up to one individual. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Henry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend these conferences, roundtable discussions. They've been very valuable, and what has come home to me and the number of meetings we've had is the promise of a lot of new innovations in the healthcare area, and it's an exciting time in medicine. I also have been struck by how dependent this whole future is on the government in the sense of NIH and FDA having the ability to do their work in a new fashion. We gave FDA a lot of authority to be more nimble, to be flexible, to work more collaboratively with those who are developing pharmaceuticals and medical devices. And I've heard a lot of praise for that. And with the NIH, there's just so clear how dependent this future is going to be on a stable and appropriate funding for biomedical research. If we've had a 10-year decrease downhill in funding for NIH, it's not just the people that work at or for NIH, it's the whole healthcare system that pays a very heavy price. So if we're determined to do anything, and I think reflecting the will of the American people overwhelmingly is, let's adequately fund NIH research and the Food and Drug Administration. I'm embarrassed, although I accept it already, that we have to fund the work of FDA through user fees. This is a government function, and those who are trying to develop new breakthroughs have to figure out how to pay the user fees. It's just, look, I authored the law to set up the user fees, but we have to do what we have to do. And we shouldn't see the constant decreasing or just flattening out of these funds which erode over the years. But I also am proud to have my constituent and friend Mike Milken here, and I thank him for his presentation. The work of this whole panel has very much relied on the work that your organization has done, particularly the 2011 discussions about barriers that prevent progress. And I was struck by the fact that you talked about the cap and trade program for the acid rain, to get rid of acid rain, which I authored. And it seems to me we need to do that for carbon as well, which is to unleash market forces. Don't think the government can do it. We need to give the right incentives and then step aside and let market forces dictate the creation of the infrastructure to accomplish the goals we want. We need to do it more in the environmental area. We especially have to do it in the health area. But part of that infrastructure must be the maintaining and stable funding of the government areas. Now, to whomever on the panel that wants to address this, legislation is a blunt instrument. We heard about the Paperwork Reduction Act, which has caused more paperwork, the reports and all of the other things that we think are going to make things easier. Instead, they make them harder. I think we would welcome legislation to reform that area. But if we come in with a blunt instrument, suddenly recreating the FDA authorities, or mandating things on the FDA, or looking for the Department of Health and Human Services to do things that they're not equipped to do, and of course then we don't fund them to do it. I think we have to be cautious about some of the legislation that may be proposed. More than anything, we want government to be there to work collaboratively, and but we still have to recognize the safety and efficacy, which American people and most people here would certainly think is necessary for a new product. But we want those products out as quickly as possible. I remember the days when we had the first evidence of the AIDS epidemic, and the people that brought home the reform at FDA to get some of these therapies out quickly were the ACT UP group in the gay community. They studied the law of FDA and argued, you don't need to take so long. You don't have to wait to the end result to show that a therapy is safe and effective. You can have markers. You can get these products out more quickly. And so I think the collaboration between the private sector, where the market forces will push them to move forward, and we want government not to stand in their way by undermining them with less stability for their work. The private sector, the disease groups, most representatives of disease groups know more about those diseases than anybody else because they've worked so hard trying to understand what's at stake. Pressing the government to be as flexible as possible, I think is important for the infrastructure for the 21st century cures. But I just want to say, I would be a little cautious about thinking we can solve big problems with legislation with all the unforeseen consequences that we can sit at a panel here 10 years from now and bemoan. I guess that's really not a question, but some comments. But I thank the witnesses, and particularly my good friend and colleague, and constituent Mike Milken for all that he has done.
Thanks, Henry. Joe Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for convening this roundtable, and thank you to the expert witnesses for your insights. Every time we have one of these hearings or roundtables, we learn a lot, and we had an excellent roundtable with Dr. Collins, Dr. Hamburg, our chairman, Dr. Burgess, Frank Pallone were there, and it was very, very important and meaningful. Dr. Collins, let me ask you, you've forcefully made the case that it's imperative for Congress to prioritize funding for NIH. And while I understand the importance of ensuring that funding for NIH remains stable and predictable, Congress is at a crossroads where federal dollars are already committed, particularly as they relate to federal entitlement and safety net programs. And if we're going to find resources to stabilize or potentially increase NIH funding, Congress is going to have to look hard at prioritizing resources that are focused on advancing science and research to help spur the next generation of cures. This is a question, are there existing sources of research funding, such as PCORI, that Congress should examine as it attempts to find federal dollars to help advance the next generation of cures? Your thoughts?
Well, I don't envy the position all of you members of Congress are in, with our nation in a very difficult fiscal deficit circumstance, trying to figure out how to balance the needs to support important government activities. And I would certainly submit that medical research is a very important government activity, which, if not supported by the U.S. government, the basic science that NIH does simply won't get done. At the same time, I know you have to figure out how not to have a circumstance where we bury our heads in the sand as the deficit grows, and so you're faced with many difficult choices. One of the things we've been trying to do, and I think it has helped a bit, is to identify other ways to support medical research other than the traditional NIH appropriation. One that has just gotten started about 6 months ago is a partnership between NIH and 10 large pharmaceutical companies called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, which is really unprecedented in its scope. The goal here is to try to identify that next generation of drug therapies that we know is waiting to be discovered given all of the breakthroughs that have happened in fields like genomics, but which will get here sooner or later, depending on how organized we are about it, and where the expertise doesn't reside in either sector alone, but putting them together, academic researchers and companies, could be pretty exciting. Companies recognizing that, and much to their credit, are willing to engage in a partnership with NIH where all the data is immediately made accessible. It's not one of those where it's hidden behind a curtain, and we would have a hard time participating if it were. And so this partnership, which is being equally supported financially by both the companies and the NIH, 50-50 split here, in an unprecedented way, is moving forward on diabetes, on Alzheimer's disease, and on rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. My colleagues in Big Pharma and I, watching personally over this closely, wanting to be sure it doesn't run off the rails, I think are quite gratified by seeing how far it's come in 6 months. So that's an example of creative ways to try to do things. We also are working in every way we can to identify partnerships with other parts of the government. DARPA, for instance, where we now have a number of very exciting initiatives, including some that aim to put cells on a chip to allow you to investigate their behavior. I have a kidney here on a chip, by the way, and I got a lung over here. And these are basically amazing technologies, bringing together the engineering skills of DARPA with the biology skills of NIH investigators to move things forward in a fashion that could be great for identifying drug toxicities as well as effectiveness. But you're asking about other places to go and look. I'm probably not in a great position to be able to say, of all the various parts of government support, well, where are there opportunities? You mentioned PCORI. I'm on the board of PCORI as by statute. The Board of Governors includes the NIH director. The Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute is what PCORI is, and they're working hard to try to identify in a research, evidence-based way what are the actual interventions that work and which ones don't work for patients in the real world. Obviously, issues that we really do need to know about. And it's a hard-working organization that's only been around for 2 or 3 years. I don't know how to balance those particular kinds of decisions that people are struggling to make. I do want to promise, though, this whole group that we're not just at NIH saying, give us money and we're just going to keep doing things the way we always have. I get it. We have to be creative. We have to make reforms in the way in which we administer our own funds that you all, through the public, give to us. And we are looking in every nook and cranny to come up with ways to be more efficient with what we've got. I promise you, this is not just researchers with their hands out saying, leave us alone. We understand the obligation to be incredibly efficient, creative about what we do, and productive. And we're willing to sort of put ourselves under the microscope about whether we're doing that right or not.
Mr. Chairman, could I just suggest a couple of, one, I would say scoring. When we look at how things are scored, we need to totally reevaluate that. And I'll quickly cite one example. A fellow board member of mine and close friend for many years, Ward Tripp Cassells, was diagnosed 13 years ago with advanced cancer and given a short period of time to live. He engaged in every known clinical trial, in this case for prostate cancer. He recovered, and over the next 11 years, I would say 10, extremely productive. He led 2 tours of duty to Iraq, where he led our medical efforts in Iraq. One in Afghanistan while he was taking chemotherapy. Became the Assistant Secretary of Defense in charge of the health of everyone in the DoD. When we had issues at Walter Reed, he was called on to solve the problems at Walter Reed. Founded 2 bioscience companies, was previously the doctor for both President Bush as a cardiologist, and hired 2,000 employees. In the scoring, everything he accomplished in those 11 years, not the least of which was 11 years more that his young children had with him, who were very young, 3, 4, 6 at the time. All of them will remember their father. Their lives will be different. Their children's lives will be different. His score was 0 of any benefits of those treatments he got. And so we just count the costs. We don't count the benefits of this great American patriot. and the 11 additional years he got. Every person and cancer dies approximately 16 years before their normal lifespan. What would those things have done? So I would say scoring. 2, internationalize. The first Gulf War, supported by Henry Kissinger and others' efforts, the United States put up 20% of the money. Other countries put up 80% of the money, and the U.S. Managed 100% of the money. There is an enormous opportunity to drive research if we focused as part of the State Department and other international efforts. Other countries on a per capita basis are far wealthier than the United States today. Norway, for example, many years ago set up a fund for the North Sea as kind of a rainy day fund. Their goal, 500 million US. That fund today approaches 900 billion. They've overshot that fund. In the United States, that would be like if you had a fund of $60 trillion sitting there. They can play, as many other nations can, an active role in activities if we had the structure here to get financial support from them today. Third, young scientists. Many things have been created to encourage young people to work in the field of teaching. And if you go and you get teaching degrees from universities, if you work in inner cities or difficult areas, we forgive their student loans that they've had. Almost all Nobel Prizes have been issued for ideas within 5 years of school. You might have been 60 years old when you received a Nobel Prize, but the idea was generated when you were 25 and 30. Today, the average age, I'm assuming, Francis, is in the low 40s, 42, 43, of the first time an individual has received a grant. How discouraging can that be for a person with new ideas today? We, all of us who've had children grow up and go to college and leave, are intellectually challenged when our teenagers leave the house and go away to college as to how something works. This is the same technology that's available in science today, but we haven't found a way to encourage people to stay in science, to stay in research, to stay with the NIH. And one of them might be easily to forgive their student loans that they've accrued being a doctor, a scientist, etc., if they work in these fields. So there's benefit the same as a teacher in the inner cities. And lastly, matching. Challenge the American public. Challenge philanthropies. We have funded over 500 young scientists. It's amazing how little the money. 100 young scientists for the FDA, 100 young scientists for the NIH and others around the country. Let's challenge the American public where you need matching grants for those young scientists. And I think we could accrue billions of dollars in matching grants here to keep young people and further their careers.
I have, thank you. I have 7 people on my list. Green, Castor, Upton, Cassidy, Shimkus, Barton, and Blackburn. Gene.
One, thank you all again for these. For those of us who serve on the Health Subcommittee, it's easy to have these kind of exchanges. But Dr. Hamburg, I want to thank you and appreciate the FDA's what you've done with our GAIN Act that we passed last session. We have a follow-up, the ADAPT Act, that would give some more authority to front-end load some of the future of antibiotics, and hopefully we'll do that. But my main question, Dr. Collins, at the July 30th and 31st joint NIH-FDA meeting on the development of new antibiotics, you mentioned that the U.S. government should launch a new public-private partnership to facilitate antibiotic development, which would work to establish a master clinical trials protocol for antibiotics. This is similar to what Mr. Milken talked about, bringing in other. Many experts have indicated that the public-private partnerships, like the New Drugs for Bad Bugs initiative in Europe, I guess they like acronyms there too, ND4BB, were crucial to bringing together key stakeholders from the government, academia and industry to tackle the significant scientific challenges facing antibiotic development. Smaller public partnerships that NIH and BERTA have already undertaken have been an important component of U.S. efforts to revitalize antibiotic R&D. Dr. Collins, can you tell us more about the plans for the larger U.S. public-private partnerships and the master trials protocol?
I certainly can, and thank you for the question, Congressman. The FDA and the NIH and industry all got together at that meeting, July 30-31. Peggy Hamburg and I worked closely through our Joint Leadership Council to plan for this. And it's a very important issue because when you see the way in which increasingly infections, particularly in hospitals, particularly in patients who are very sick in ICUs, turn out to be from organisms that resist all known antibiotics. We are on a trajectory that is really quite frightening. And the delivery of new antibiotics through the pipeline has been quite slow for mostly financial reasons. That is, the development of a new antibiotic is not seen by most pharmaceutical companies as necessarily something that's going to be very profitable. You may have a small market, a short time that drug is delivered, a lot of liability concerns. So here we are in a circumstance where the bacteria are increasingly, through evolutionary processes after being exposed to way too much drug prescribing, which is going on both in hospitals and in agriculture, are developing these resistances, and we don't have, at the present time, a fully effective strategy. One of the things that we need as part of that strategy, and this was the main topic of that meeting, was to have a pre-existing network of clinical trial sites so that if a company says, we now have a promising new antibiotic, you want to use that on people who are infected with these highly resistant organisms, but you have to find them. Fortunately, right now, you don't find them everywhere. They tend to happen in outbreaks. If you don't have already a pre-existing network with staff on the ground, with consent forms, with IRB approvals, then the company has their drug, but there's no way to check it out and see if it works in less than many, many months. So the idea is to have a master clinical protocol, and NIH, through our National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, is very invested already in making this happen in order to provide industry with that kind of a platform. It's a great example of a partnership where we all have a lot in common, a lot of needs here. There will be, by the way, in the relatively near future, a lot more information about plans that we've been cooking up over many months now about how to take a systematic look at this problem of antimicrobial resistance. Perhaps even in the next week or two, there's going to be more about this coming from the President's Council advisors and from a bunch of the rest of us.
We hear a lot about Ebola and the only 2 doctors who were able to get something, but you know, MRSA is in every hospital in the country, and it's, you know, where we have our loved ones and our constituents. So thank you for that effort, and hopefully we can move forward with it.
30 seconds. That's great. All right, that's good. Bill Parfit, I had the opportunity to go through your wonderful facility a number of times this last year and see the advances of what you have done as it relates to animal testing that can then help the drug industry. Tell us a little bit about, you know, as we think about trains traveling at the same speeds, but the tracks are the same. Let's talk about changing those tracks and what you've been able to do with the science to, in fact, improve the testing and expedite the approvals of what you're able to do.
Well, you were there, Fred, when we launched our molecular imaging capabilities in preclinical work. And while imaging is not new, its broad use is gaining momentum daily. And in many cases, on a regulatory basis, the regulations haven't kept up with this science. Now, that's not a criticism, believe me. It's not a criticism at all. No, but this isn't one. But, for example, there's no FDA imaging approved for biomarkers for early stage. And yet, when our clients and our sponsors go for approval, the FDA, in a great way, talks about the old archaic ways of working through toxicology and whatnot, and even some efficacy work, and then says, we know that you're not required to do imaging, but do you have any? And of course we do, and that results in it. Now, what that says to me is it's our fault that we're not keeping pace with changing technology. And so I think in the case of the regulatory environment within which we live, that it's so hard for regulations to keep pace. It's so hard for regulations to really help allow for new innovative methods to be tested and used. That maybe there's some way to have an emerging issues task force or something along those lines, and I'm sure you've thought of this before, where when new technologies are available or being used, perhaps not in the mainstream of regulatory approval, but are being used to supplement insight into drugs, and again with imaging in particular for clinical trials. It's incredible what kind of insight has been achieved as a result of looking again at biomarkers and absorption, et cetera. So if there were emerging issues task force where, in this case, in a very collaborative way, the sponsors in this case, the researchers, the innovators, could work with the regulators, could work with academia, the specialists, the subject matter experts, so that we could quickly allow some of this to happen. Now, I know this is a litigious world that we live in, but we're breaking new science, and risk is part of it. So what you saw there is it's not, there's a lot more advanced technology and science than just imaging, but it's coming of age today. It can clearly add significant insight, reduce cost, improve speed, as you saw and you know. And I would encourage that part of your legislation would allow us in a collaborative way to be able to work together to be able to allow to experiment and allow to work, let these new technologies help us meet the goals and objectives that you've defined.
Just a quick comment on that. Very important point, and it raises sort of two different issues in my mind. One really speaks to, I think, a broader opportunity that builds on this notion of the importance of public-private partnership and collaborative research in critical areas. There are things, biomarkers, various kinds of computer models or simulations or other kinds of approaches where no one company is necessarily going to want to take the risk of trying to develop it and characterize it and get it validated, because there's a lot of risk and a lot of cost. But if these activities could be undertaken and we could identify these new research and regulatory review tools, whole classes of products would benefit and many companies would benefit. And so we really need to be able to find ways to take some of those research dollars and make sure that they are targeted to these critical areas that are gaps in current research funding that require some of the kinds of new public-private partnership models as well, so you get the best minds around the table working on these projects that often are really complicated and involve emerging technologies and how best to use them. And we've seen the benefit already in the biomarkers area, for example, in the Biomarkers Consortium, but these are really underdeveloped models for public-private partnership and so-called pre-competitive collaborative research, and they're really under-resourced in terms of research funding at the present time. So I think it's a critical need, and it's one where we know that if we develop it, it will make a huge difference. The other thing is that, you know, the regulatory process is really cumbersome, and Congressman Waxman noted that Congress recently gave us some new strategies and authorities to be more nimble and flexible, but, you know, putting regulations into place takes years, and the notice and comments process is an important one for getting input, but, you know, it's lengthy, et cetera. So, you know, thinking about what are some of the models for how to work in more responsive, more collaborative, and more flexible ways in these kinds of situations where an emerging technology and an emerging opportunity is there, I think is a challenge. I don't know if it can be fixed by legislation per se at the present time, but I think it's an area that we need to delve more deeply into because it really matters.
I agree with all that she said. And in the end, I know in my early years in the pharmaceutical industry that one of the major concerns was we have to do everything ourselves. It's our proprietary information. We're not going to share it with others. You don't see that anymore. There's not a drug that gets developed today that hasn't been developed by somebody, cross-licensed with somebody else. There is that collaboration. So I think the movement is underfoot. We just have to provide the framework that encourages it to happen so that we can indeed get these 21st century cures to the public much sooner than we currently do. And I think it's all there, but collaboration is clearly the key.
Thank you. Kathy.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Upton and Congresswoman DeGette, and all of my colleagues who are focused on 21st Century Cures effort, and to our expert panel. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Since this effort was launched, I've been hearing a great deal from academic research institutes across the state of Florida, our great researchers at the Moffitt Cancer Center, the robust and growing biomedical field in Florida. And their top issue is Congress provide sustained funding to the NIH. That is the number one when you begin to talk about what the Congress should be doing. That is number one. It's followed closely on the shortage of physician residents and these young scientists. And I've heard some great ideas here today, but we have this issue as well with how Medicare pays for physician residents, and there's a shortage in a number of states. We were supposed to go and look at nationwide the health workforce, and we haven't done that yet, and I think hopefully it could be incorporated into what we're doing. I'd like to follow on the last exchange on the biomarkers, because what I'm hearing at home after mapping of the human genome is that, boy, here comes some very cost-effective tests through biomarkers and others that would they would give folks quicker information that they need on their health. They would be a substitute for a very expensive, invasive type of test. And the folks want to know, well, why when we get these approved, do I have to go back to CMS and start all over again to get something approved for Medicare to pay for? Or is this a problem that you all are hearing about? Maybe Dr. Theodorescu and Dr. Collins and Mr. Parfit can talk about that. There seems to be these emerging cost-effective tests out there that would help us save money down the road and give patients quicker answers.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think it's a really important issue, and you know, I think we're in the middle of three revolutions. We're in the omics revolution, genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, et cetera. We're in the big data revolution, and then we're in the middle of a healthcare revolution. So I think I'd like to answer your question with two answers. One is that I think in terms of public and private partnerships, I think we need to enhance the richness and the potential and the attractiveness of the data that the federal government provides to pharmaceutical partnerships by really providing a coalesced data set of all clinical trials that are federally supported. That will make mining that data set by companies and in the examples that Dr. Collins gave, would make the cooperation with the federal government a lot more attractive. That's how we can enhance things in terms of basically biomarker work as well as industry government partnerships. The other issue that would facilitate these biomarkers is, as I was saying earlier, is to support often these smaller companies that cannot really afford to do clinical trials with biomarkers by expanding the coverage with evidence development, the CED program in HHS. That's a good way to potentially cover some of these biomarkers as we're gaining the knowledge through registries to see if their effectiveness. And also, you know, as you probably know, Moffitt has the concept of total cancer care, which we have a very good relationship with Bill Dalton there, and we're about to launch a joint venture with them. And so the concept of moving those kind of biomarkers through the Orion system or the total cancer care, where there's these large consortia that we're all going to pool together to really push forward the discovery of markers and then the validation of that in these large data sets. It comes down to really managing and leveraging big data across multiple institutions to really not only develop new biomarkers, but also validate them. And part of that is the coverage with evidence development. If that could be expanded, that would help a lot, as well as supporting a central repository for all federally funded clinical trials. That would also be a boon to industry partnerships and making those very attractive. Thank you.
Thanks. Bill Cassidy.
First, let me just thank you all for your good work. I am struck, though, I think it's a little ironic because I think Congress has created a lot of problems that we have here, or at least the federal government has. Mr. Kamen, I'm struck the 3% tax you speak of is obviously part of the Affordable Care Act, an example. Now, I guess I have two questions, but along that theme. I'm a fellow that formerly did clinical research. I've gone through those 40-page documents. We wrote ours at 6th grade, not 8th grade. And I was always told that it was the Office of Human Research Protection, which is part of HHS, that required this. Whenever I asked about centralized IRB, I was always told, no, wait a second, we're required to have a local representative. And although I know there's a central IRB in Denver, for whatever reason, my institution did not allow that because they felt like the federal government required. And I'm looking at you, Dr. Hamburg, even though it's not under your office, FDA is so involved with that. So first question is, that 40-page document, I'm always been told, is because of Washington, D.C. saying you had to have it. Secondly, Dr. Collins, you and I have spoken about this in committee, but there's a report coming out of, we've spoken about how NIH needs more funding, but there's an article out of UCSF, Claiborne Johnson's last author, Leslie Gillum first, speaking about how there's a very poor correlation in NIH funding between disease burden, however defined, and where NIH puts its money. Now, this fellow wrote, and he said 10 years ago this was a critique, but as he reviewed data 10 years after that, there had been no change. I think you had mentioned there's a little bit of wiggle room in terms of moving dollars around, but what I'm most familiar with at CDC, at one point they were spending $1 billion on HIV and like 60,000 on hepatitis, even though the number of deaths related to liver disease was at least as great as that of HIV, and disease burden was even greater. So there seems to be a really lousy correlation between where we're spending our dollar and disease burden. So two questions. One, have we met the enemy and he is us when it comes to the complexity of getting clinical trials approved? And secondly, to what degree are our federal agencies not taking the scarce dollar we have and moving it to things like Alzheimer's, dementia, neurologic diseases, when that is our balloon note, if you will, away from things that, frankly, we've had a great deal of success with. So, Dr. Hamburg, perhaps you first.
Well, first, I think that you have raised a set of really important issues that we're all working on, and certainly Francis and I have spent a lot of time discussing the value of central IRBs and, more broadly, the importance of reducing the time, cost, and cumbersomeness of doing clinical trials in this country. And anything we can do to reduce that and make clinical trials more accessible to patients, because that is another barrier to advancing clinical trials and ultimately the delivery of opportunity in science into a real-world product. So I think that this is a really important issue. I think it's one that ultimately this effort, the 21st Century Cures, will likely take on in some way or another, and I applaud that. And I think that it is an area where it has to be done right, but where there are things that Congress can do to actually make the situation better, not worse. Big picture, there are many others than FDA that need to be engaged in that discussion, and you're right that there's a critical office in HHS that's involved in this. But work has been done, work needs to continue to be done, but I think we're ready to do some things that will make a difference. On a much smaller scale with respect to FDA, there's something that Congress could do very quickly that I think would enable clinical trials in the device area to be more efficient and effective, and that is that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually has a requirement in it right now that mandates review of a clinical trial on a device by a local IRB. And we think that if that could be amended, and I think it's a pretty simple fix, we could do some good.
Done. Done. Francis, yeah, go ahead.
So, Congressman, appreciate both of those very significant questions. Just a quick coda to what Peggy said about human subjects review. There has been an effort underway now for about 5 years to revise the common rule, and particularly to emphasize the need for central IRBs instead of having every institution in a multi-site trial have their own IRB, tinkering with the consent form, adding another paragraph, changing the tense of the verb, and all of that stuff that ends up costing you oftentimes a year of time and a lot of pages that get generated along the way. It is irrational. We need to stop this whole approach. Actually, NCI, the Cancer Institute, for their large-scale cancer clinical trials, is now using central IRBs. There were some objections to that from institutions who are afraid that they might be liable if their IRB hadn't approved it, but those have largely been overcome. We can do this. We just need to get on with that, and I appreciate you raising the issue. In terms of this correlation between funding support and specific diseases, we look at that a lot. That's certainly one of the jobs that I and the 27 institute and center directors at NIH talk about almost every week when we gather around the table. Actually, if you look at the current plot, and I'd be glad to send it to you, it is not that wildly out of whack from what you might think. If you look at various measures of disease, whether you're talking about deaths or whether you're talking about such things as dailies and qualies, which are more measurements of what the impact is on individuals in terms of quality of life and disability. Actually, that curve is a reasonable approximation to what you might think would make sense from a public health perspective, with a couple of outliers like AIDS.
AIDS is what, that's like saying AIDS is getting a heck of a lot relative to Alzheimer's. I'm always struck someone with HIV is now more likely to die of dementia than he is to die of immunoincompetence. So ignoring AIDS, I think, is kind of an odd thing.
I'm saying AIDS is an outlier in that graph, but I think there are scientific reasons why that has been the case, namely that this is not just a disease of this country, it's a threat to the entire global circumstance.
Thank you. Your relative funding of Alzheimer's relative to that is minuscule. And again, my dad dies of it. We all have a parent. And I got to say, when I look at your funding for Alzheimer's, it seems minuscule relative to the disease burden and the future expense, the near future expense to Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera.
I'm deeply concerned about Alzheimer's, Congressman, and actually have spent some of my own personal efforts trying to do some readjustment of the way in which our current portfolio supports that research, because this is clearly a major threat to the future of our nation and the world, and an enormous burden upon individuals and their families who are stricken with this disease. And there's probably nobody in this room that has not been touched by that. And I take your point that we need to see that as a particularly high priority right now, and that has been, in fact, what we have been trying to do at NIH over the last 2 or 3 years. The other thing that I want to say, and I don't want to take up too much more time, is that we have to be careful with the way in which science has developed over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly coming from insights from the genome. We discover that there are connections between diseases that we never knew about. It would not surprise me if the next breakthrough that we're really waiting for in Alzheimer's disease came from a researcher who at present time we would not say is working on that disease, but is working on some other area. These connections between pathways continually surprise us. And so I think we do have to be careful not to be so targeted that we miss out on the unexpected, where somebody working in one field actually comes up with the aha moment.
But the billion spent on AIDS has paid great dividends. And so targeted research cannot be replaced with serendipity. I guess that's my point. And it seems like on some of this we're hoping for serendipity.
Well, I think we need both. I think targeted research is critical when we can see a pathway towards finding a solution for a disease. But serendipity and supporting basic science that is not too tightly connected to a disease is one of the reasons that America has been so successful for the last 50 years.
Thank you.
Dr. Gingrey.
I don't know if I've got this mic on or not. Is the mic on? Yep. Oh, good, good. I want to thank all the members of the panel. You've done a fantastic job. I do apologize for coming in a little bit late and missing an important aspect of it. Representative DeGette, Chairman Upton, this 21st Century Cures initiative and these roundtable discussions, I think, have been absolutely invaluable. There are a number of physicians, of course, on our committee. There are a number of people on our committee that have knowledge far beyond my limited medical knowledge, but it has been a great effort as we go forward in the 21st century. Dr. Hamburg, I'm going to address my question to you. Representative Green, my colleague on the committee from Texas and the co-author of the GAIN Act. We are now, of course, as you know, working on the ADAPT Act to take that a step further for limited population antibacterial drugs. And maybe you didn't get a chance really to, he diverted his question back to Dr. Collins, so you didn't get a chance to really discuss that. But I would like for you to spend a little time talking about the ADAPT Act and what that model maybe can be an example for other efforts in bringing other drugs to market and medical devices in these highly specialized need areas, resistant antibiotics, limited populations.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for your leadership on the critical issue of how can we ensure an adequate pipeline in terms of new drug development in the antibiotic arena, which is ever more important as we're seeing drug resistance spread. You know, I think Dr. Collins did address a critical part of why the GAIN Act was important in terms of needing to create new focus and incentives for drug development in this area. It has been a hard area in terms of companies wanting to really invest because market forces don't make it just irresistible in terms of return on investment, especially when you have to take risks. I have to be honest and say that FDA didn't make it irresistible either, because we were really asking for very elaborate, large clinical trials that were timely, costly, and hard to recruit patients for all the reasons that that Dr. Collins mentioned in terms of the complexity of doing these studies and being able to have the clinical trial ready to go when the patient appears sometimes deathly ill with an infection that needs to be treated. So I think, you know, what we're trying to think about now is how, especially in the context of antimicrobial resistance, which is such an urgent problem, how can we really design regulatory pathways that enable us to get meaningful answers as quickly as possible and reduce the risk for developers. And a sort of special population approach enables us to sort of look at the highest risk end of a spectrum of patients that might be treated and really narrow the focus so that we can ask and answer questions where the risk-benefit falls out as clearly as possible and enable us to move forward more swiftly. And I think, you know, that's really, you know, what we're thinking about there. It applies in antimicrobial resistance and new antimicrobial development. It applies in other areas that are important to public health as well, including a very heterogeneous disease category like obesity, where if you can sort of narrow the indication, the development process can actually be sped.
Joe Barton.
Mr. Chairman.
Joe's brought his own expert with him.
Yeah. I didn't think we had enough firepower here with the head of NIH and HHS and one of the billionaires who's put a lot of money into medical research. So I brought my own, this is my volunteer staff assistant, Dr. Yamoto, Vice Chancellor for Research at University of California, San Francisco, who calls Dr. Homburg Peggy. He said, "Oh, Peggy's down there. I want to go say hi to Peggy." So we were meeting with him.
You can call me Peggy, too.
But I am very impressed, Mr. Chairman, with the panel you put together today. Obviously, to have these eminences here is just amazing. My question is going to be pretty similar to Mr. Pitt's, but with a little different twist. We brought the deficit down from $1.5 trillion to $0.5 trillion, but it's still $0.5 trillion. And with all the good intentions in the world, and I've introduced NIH reform bills and double the funding of NIH back in the Gingrich era, and I've introduced a authorization bill that increased funding for NIH every year. But the reality is you're going to get what you get plus a little bit. That's just so. Given that, I want to ask Mr. Milken, is there anything we can do to incentivize the private sector to give more, to match some sort of a special tax break for medical research, or perhaps even some sort of a government match? If the private sector puts up so much, the government will match it dollar for dollar, or maybe 1 for 2 or something. Because we obviously, and I think the chairman is with me on this, in a perfect world, we'd want to increase across the board, but in the real world, we're going to have to find ways to do better with what we have right now. So are there some things we could do next year in terms of giving incentives to the private sector that might actually result in measurable increases in private funding in these areas?
Thank you, and I want to thank you for your work that you do, and I'm excited to see my good friend Keith Yamamoto with you today. And as he's aware, there are a number of efforts right now on the potential for a match, where you would go to private citizens, foundations, corporations, and the government would challenge them by offering to put up $1 if they were matched for $1 in the philanthropy standpoint. One of the things, there are other countries in the world that allow you to have a higher deduction if you give money to medical research or bioscience. In the United States today, you are limited on your deductions to 30. You can use 30% of your income for public foundations and 20% for private. In some other countries, they've allowed you to have a tax deduction up to 50% if it's for medical research, science, etc. So I think, as we saw in the efforts in acid rain and SO2, that you can create incentives that would direct funds accordingly. And one of the risks we run, I think that we're all aware of, is that a number of the people that have accumulated wealth are not as focused on inheritance taxes, because they're planning to give their money when they pass away to foundations, and the opportunity to accelerate that. One example I might give you is IRAs and 401ks, but particularly IRAs today. When you're 70 and a half, you begin to draw money out of those IRAs and are potentially taxed. I think many people, if we afforded the opportunity to give money to charity now, instead of waiting 20 years or 10 years, would give the money in their IRAs and 401ks. There was an experiment that was tried a few years ago where you could give up to $100,000 without tax out of your IRAs, and it ran for 2 years, and I think $140 million was given. But if you took the limit of $100,000 off and tried it for a couple years, you might be surprised how much of private sector money is willing to go And if you decided it needed to go into medical philanthropy or whatever the decisions were, I think you could tap that. Third, I think today the issue of young scientists. I think if we had a formal program initiated, you would have a lot of funding from individuals, whether it's through their own academic institutions that they felt loyalty or they went to support these young scientists. And we have spoken to Dr. Collins and also Commissioner Hamburg about the possibility through their private foundations, could we help augment the funding? Many years ago, I was touring the NIH and saw a young scientist, and there wasn't going to be funding for the scientist, and sent a check to the NIH to cover the funding for that scientist. 9 months later, they figured out how to cash the check.
We're better now.
But told us not to ever do that again. And I told them there was another agency, the IRS,
By then
that
it was no good. It bounced.
but they're getting better, as Dr. Collins said. But I think we have not appealed to the American public enough to incentivize them. We see initiatives such as recently with ALS and putting an ice bucket on your head that raised $100 million, and they used to raise $2 million. In the area of men's cancers, the growing of a mustache in November, called Movember, worldwide now raises $150 million a year. So how do you communicate? And one of the challenges has been, how do you get small amounts of money from large numbers of people? And this has been a challenge, and companies like Safeway, through their checkout program, probably have raised $500 million for different diseases, breast cancer, prostate cancer, muscular dystrophy, and others. Average donation, $2. If you send a check in to a medical research foundation, it probably cost us $15 to process it, notify it, etc. And so these other mechanisms, which Safeway did at the checkout counter, rounding up, allow you to get millions of people involved with small contributions. And I think you can, through some policy changes, run some tests here and maybe run them for a year or two and see what happens. I think the risk is, in an area I spoke of early, scoring. Okay, they're going to tell you that it's going to cost, billions of dollars in future taxes in the next 40 years. But I come back to the statement that 50% of all economic growth has come from advances in extension of life and increasing the quality of life. And I think by accelerating the giving, we have young people in our country today that are in their 20s that are worth $30 billion. Should they wait until they're 70 or 80 years old, or should we try to tap in to both their intellect and their funds today by incentivizing them on a present value basis to support it today? And so I think there's a number of areas that we could test. There's trillions of dollars in these IRAs. Should we wait? If you wait till you pass away, you can give it to your foundation tax-free. No estate tax. Why don't we encourage them today to participate? So I think there's a number of things we could do with private industry. I think there's another factor. We have surveyed cancer patients. We have set up so many regulations on collection of data and accessing of data. We are protecting people that don't want to be protected. 600 million people on this planet go to Facebook every day. They put information and secrets up online that anyone in the world can access, that you can't even believe that they're saying that or putting it up on their website. More than 70% of all cancer survivors will be willing to make all their data public, all their tests public, so that any graduate, PhD, MD student could access that data. How do you waive HIPAA? How do you give up these rights to protect information you don't want to protect? And so I think there's a lot of work that could be done in data collection. When I was at Berkeley in the 1960s and was focused on how do we access capital for small and medium businesses, as a student with little to no money, I was able to access free the CRISP tapes, which summarized financial transactions and markets under the guidance of the University of Chicago, covering the previous 50 years at no cost. To try to create these data sets sometimes could cost $100 million. Who has access to this data? We could provide enormous data, but I do think one of the elements is, how do you waive your privacy rights if you don't want that privacy?
That buzzer means that's 12 o'clock. I said we're going to have a hard stop at 12, and so we are. I want to really thank, really thank everybody here that was involved in the thoughtful discussion, not only today but in recent months as well. Your ideas have in fact triggered us to move. I want to commend our staff. That's really. But we're not done. This is the last formal meeting, this month, because we're getting out of session, I think, next week. But I know that during the next couple weeks, I know this weekend I'm going to Oregon and Washington State. I know we're going to have an event in Kalamazoo. I think there's going to be an event or two in Texas and Florida and other states. I would encourage our members to do that, to reach out, to continue to listen, because when we do come back, we're going to start writing, and we're going to try to do our best to do it right. And as I said at the beginning, our goal is to move this early next year. Have a draft proposal done early next year. In all likelihood, it won't be done this year. I don't want to set that. So we'll miss you, Dr. Gingrich, because he is retiring from the Congress, and some others, Mr. Waxman and others. But the ideas need to come in. Because we really do want to do this right, and lots of shoulders we're going to be leaning on to make sure that it happens, and we're most grateful for the administration's support too. Peggy, you've done a good job. You realize constructively where we need to go. Sylvia Burwell today again confirmed the administration's support for this. We're reaching out to the Senate. Dr. Collins has been a superstar, not only in this room, but traveling to different parts of the country as well. And of course, Michael, your work again, we stole a lot from you over the last couple years, and just the outstanding work that you've done and committed in the foundation and the organization that you have has truly helped us. And, great entrepreneurs, Bill Parfit and Dean Kamen both, Dr. Tedescu for your work, and again 2 weeks ago, I guess, in Colorado. But now we're very grateful for that assistance, and we're going to turn the green light on in this green room. Thank you.
Thank you.